there is a photograph, still on display at the Q Chi Tunnels historical site outside Ho Chi Minh City, of an underground kitchen that fed hundreds of people a day in the middle of a war zone. American reconnaissance pilots flew over that stretch of jungle constantly, trained to watch for one of the clearest signs of human activity: smoke. For years, they never found one. No smoke column, no obvious kitchen, no obvious people. Just jungle. Whatever was happening beneath that ground stayed invisible from above, and it kept people fed through the war. The question of how comes later. First comes a much older one, because that kitchen wasn't solving a new problem. It was the newest attempt at a problem humans had been wrestling with since long before anyone thought to write anything down. Fire has always made a promise it can't fully keep. It offers warmth, cooked food, protection, light pushed back against the dark, nearly everything that makes survival easier. But it pays for that gift with a signal. Smoke climbs. It drifts for miles on a still night, hangs over valleys, marks a location as clearly as a flag on a hill. For a species that spent most of its history being hunted as often as it hunted and competing with other bands for the same scarce, doomed ground, that signal could turn a source of safety into an invitation. So somewhere in the deep, undocumented stretch of human prehistory, a question had to be answered, over and over, by people with no written language and no formal science to answer it with. How do you depend on something that constantly gives away exactly where you are? To feel the size of that problem, imagine a small group at the mouth of a rock shelter as the light fails. This isn't a campfire in the recreational sense. It's the only thing standing between them and a night that could kill them. But the same fire that keeps the cold and the predators out also throws a column of smoke straight up against a darkening sky. Visible from the next ridge, the next river bend, to eyes that might not be friendly, every warm meal doubles as a flare. That tension wasn't faced once. It was faced most nights, for an almost unimaginable stretch of time, by people with far less margin for error than we have now. So how far back does this actually go? The investigation starts underground, in ash, that has survived, long after everything else has turned to dust. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, deep inside a passage, where no wildfire could ever have reached on its own, researchers have found burnt bone in layers now dated to between roughly 1.7 and 1.79 million years old. A study published in 2026 that pushed the site's confirmed fire record back hundreds of thousands of years further than anything previously established. The bones carry a specific chemical signature that heat leaves and natural decay doesn't. It doesn't prove those early humans could strike a flame from nothing. What it strongly suggests is that they were carrying fire in and keeping it. Which means this is the latest chapter in a problem that may reach back more than 1 million years into human history. That single fact reframes everything that follows, because it means fire wasn't an occasional event in early human life. It was becoming a fixture, and fixtures have to be managed. Move forward enormously in time, to Neanderthal sites like Abric Romani in Spain, and the hearth stopped looking accidental. They're repeated, structured, placed against walls and overhangs in ways that happen to draw smoke up and away rather than out across where people slept and ate. And people who lived by fire every night had already worked out, through nothing but repetition and consequence, something modern combustion science would only formalize much later. Dry wood burns cleaner than wet. A hot, tight fire smokes less than a smothered, smoldering one. A hearth tucked against stone behaves differently than one left in the open. Nobody needed the chemistry to notice the pattern. They only needed stinging eyes, a bad night's sleep, a fire that gave them away, and a memory for what fixed it. 20th century researchers working alongside hunter-gatherer communities from the Kalahari to Aboriginal Australia found that exact knowledge still being taught around real fires. Which timber burns clean, which one smolders and betrays your position, how to keep coals alive without ever building a visible flame at all. Not abstract science. Survival literacies. Handed down at the very fires it concerned. Refined by the plain fact that the people who remembered it were more likely to be the ones who survived to pass it on. For a long time, it's tempting to assume the danger being managed was animal. Lions, wolves, whatever had claws and patience. But there was another kind of threat our ancestors couldn't outrun, because it could think, plan, and track exactly the way they could. Other humans. Archaeological evidence of territorial pressure and intergroup conflict runs deep into prehistory. And once you sit with that, the entire question changes shape. Managing a fire's visibility wasn't only about staying hidden from something with fangs. In some places, at some times, it may have meant staying hidden from us, which means the real skill being developed, wasn't just building a better fire. It was learning to hide the evidence that a fire, and the people beside it, existed at all. It's worth being honest about where the evidence actually stops, because that honesty is part of the story. Structured hearths, repeated over generations in positions that reduce visible smoke. That's solid archaeology, found across continents. That certain fire building choices dramatically cut smoke output. That's basic physics, testable today. But whether any specific ancient family was consciously hiding from a specific rival group on a specific night is something no hearth can tell us. Ash preserve behavior. It doesn't preserve intention. What survives is a pattern that looks again and again like people quietly getting better at not being found, without necessarily naming it that way themselves. That gap between behavior and motive is exactly why the myths took hold so easily, long before anyone in Vietnam ever dug a flue. Every culture loves a story about outwitting a stronger enemy with nothing but cleverness and the materials at hand, and a smokeless fire is close to the perfect vessel for that story. Dramatic, plausible, and true often enough to feel eternal. But the deeper reality is less like one inventor's secret and more like an enormous accumulation of small, unglamorous decisions. Which wood to gather, which way to angle a hearth, how large to let a flame grow. Repeated by so many people for so long that it eventually produced something that functions exactly like camouflage, even if no single person ever set out to invent it. Which brings the story back to that kitchen at Cu Chi. Its designer, a former army chef named Huang Kum, dug underground flues that split the smoke, cooled it, and let the surrounding earth filter it before it ever reached open air, releasing only a faint haze that dispersed before it could rise as a visible plume. He wasn't reaching back into history when he built it. He was solving the same immediate, brutal problem his ancestors had always solved, arriving at a version of the same solution independently, under fire, because the underlying problem had never really changed. Only the enemy watching the sky had. What's easy to miss, standing this far downstream from it, is how strange an inheritance this actually is. It isn't a monument, it isn't a text anyone wrote down and passed along. It's a habit, carried in muscle memory, in a parent's hand correcting a child's, in the quiet decision to reach for one branch instead of another, that outlasted empires, outlasted written language, outlasted almost everything else our species has ever made. No single hearth can tell us what its makers were thinking. But somewhere on a hillside over 1,000,000 years ago, one fire gave its makers away, and somehow, eventually, a great many others didn't. And every fire built quietly since has carried a trace of that long, unrecorded learning forward. A way of staying alive without telling the world exactly where to find you.